So in today's video, I'm sharing how embracing powerlessness can accelerate your codependency recovery. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what is powerlessness and why is it so critical in your recovery from codependency. But if you're new, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So what is codependency? Codependency is basically a relationship pattern where you hyper-focus on helping, rescuing, or controlling people, situations, outcomes in order to get your self-worth. And that almost always traces back into childhood. So in 12-step recovery or codependency recovery, issues of control are going to be important to deal with. Because if you don't, you're going to make limited progress in your recovery, and I don't want that for you. If you're in codependency recovery, say me too in the comments. I'm right there with you. So the first step in codependency recovery is admitting your powerlessness. And let's face it, most of us who are codependent really don't want to do that. There are going to be certain aspects of recovery that you may resist more than others, and that's perfectly normal. So if you're working an Al-Anon program, the first step is about being powerless over alcohol. And you may think, well, I'm not the drinker, that doesn't make any sense. But what you're powerless over is trying to control the alcohol for the alcoholic. This can also mean that you are trying to control somebody else's behavior. You want them to get sober. You want them to stop yelling at you. You want them to treat you better. You want the narcissist to care more about your feelings. Because part of our codependency is trying to fix other people's problems and get in there and give advice that may or may not be asked for. Because we see our job and our role in our relationships as fixers, helpers, somebody who can help the other person feel better. Because that's how we get our value. The problem is that we don't realize, unless we're in recovery, that we're actually overstepping into somebody else's life. So what does powerlessness look like for people who have codependency in their relationships? So where the codependent person becomes powerless is in their attempts to control people, places, and outcomes. And we do this not because we're bad people or because we're control freaks, but because we've learned to be hypervigilant and to control our surroundings so that we can feel safe. Because as kids, we didn't have any control over our environment, and it often created a lot of fear and powerlessness. But in our recovery, powerlessness is actually a positive thing because it's going to give you the line between what's your responsibility and what isn't your responsibility in any relationship or situation that you're in. Because often when you're codependent, you get easily overwhelmed by taking too much responsibility for what other people do or the outcomes of certain events because you feel responsible for changing it or making it better. But part of our struggle when we get into recovery is that we realize we've overfunctioned for so long, which basically means you're doing way too much for one person. And usually that leads to a lot of anxiety and a lot of burnout. But that's the good news. When we hit that wall and realize I'm doing too much, something has to give. So why is it so challenging to see our own powerlessness? In recovery, we may see that as a weakness. We may see that as giving up or not caring about people. But actually that's not true. It's just a difference in focus. So the first step when you're trying to deal with powerlessness is recognize the situations where you don't have any control over. So I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. Because when we have codependency in our relationships, we do too much. We help too much. We overstep a lot. Not because we're bad people, but because we don't know another way to get our value. So let's talk about some examples of powerlessness. One that's super common in codependency is trying to change somebody else's behavior. This may be somebody who drinks too much or somebody that's mistreating you. So the powerlessness comes in when we realize, oh my God, I cannot change this person at all. Maybe you've tried everything under the sun to get them to change their behavior or to become better people, but it doesn't work. That is your powerlessness, to realize that you've hit that wall and you absolutely can't change that other person's behavior no matter how hard you try. Another example of powerlessness is realizing that you can't make a relationship healthy all by yourself. You can do your part, you can make it healthy up to a point, But if you're with somebody who's really toxic and abusive, you're not going to be able to totally change that cycle. Another example of powerlessness is realizing that you can't prevent somebody else's consequences. So when a loved one is hurting, you probably feel a lot more pain than the average person. You're super sensitive and empathetic, mostly because their pain is making you feel anxious because it may be triggering your own pain. So another example of where we're powerless is certain things that happen to us in life. Maybe you lost a job suddenly, or a relationship ended, or somebody got sick and died. Those are all external things that we have no control over. Sometimes bad things, unexpected things happen, and part of recovery is learning how to deal with it. Another example of powerlessness is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. This is a common one. So if you're at that place where you're sick and tired of doing the same thing over and over again, that's where powerlessness is showing up for you. And that's a good thing, because let's talk about the benefits of powerlessness. When you can accept where you're powerless in your life, whether it's other people, outcomes, behaviors, you'll actually get relief. Because part of what codependency does for people is it contributes to our overwhelm, because we're responsible for everybody and everything versus just being responsible for ourselves. When I recognize my powerlessness over somebody else's behavior, it helps me detach, and it helps me remember that, you know what, I'm not responsible for something outside of myself. I'm only responsible for my own behavior and what I do to contribute to a situation. That's a lot more manageable for me on a day-to-day basis. But when we're taking responsibility for everything and everybody, we often feel anxious and overwhelmed. So in accepting our powerlessness, it helps us stay on our side of the street, which is part of what recovery is about. It also helps us not be superhuman, because when we're overfunctioning, we often are going at 150 miles an hour, and that's not healthy. So what's the goal with powerlessness in recovery? It basically accelerates our recovery because it immediately tells us where we are responsible and where we aren't, where we can let go of what doesn't serve us or even belong to us. Like, for instance, somebody else's behavior. So what's the goal in codependency recovery? By admitting where we're powerless, we're going to be able to set better boundaries, because we're going to know what we're responsible for and what we're not responsible for. We can start to look at other people's problems as their responsibility, not ours. And that's what's going to help decrease the overwhelm and stress in your life. Because if we don't look at our powerlessness, we're not going to be able to deal with those issues of control. And that's super critical in codependency recovery. Because if we're still trying to control people, places, and things in order to be safe, we're still externally focused. But the goal is to be internally focused and to create our own safety despite what's happening outside of us. That's real recovery. Now, the challenges of looking at our powerlessness is that it's a pretty major change, because we're going from trying to control everything to trying to pull back and only control ourselves. So this is going to be a habit that's going to take time. It's also going to take a lot of patience and a lot of practice. But again, the value of powerlessness is that it's going to free you up to feel less responsible for others and more responsible for just you, which is a lot more manageable in your codependency recovery. So the next thing I want you to do is go watch my video on 12-step programs for codependency recovery. Thanks so much.